today?
I thought about that. Let me start that.
Sorry about that. Yeah. All right. Victor, you are recording?
Yes, started recording.
Perfect. And you can see my screen, right?
Yes.
All right. So without any further delay, let's get started. Now, we are here to learn about interviews, and we all know that interviews are a very well-established field. It has been used in many different fields for a very long time, and people have been adapting it to their own fields in different ways. So just to make sure that we are all on the same page, it's going to be informal. We're going to have lots of discussions. I will let you ask questions at the end of the presentation, and I have also shared a document where you can write your questions. And in between, after I talk about a particularly difficult topic or something that might be a bit confusing, I will let you ask questions myself. All right? On the same page?
Yeah.
All right. So we all know interviews are really good at getting information, but I still want to focus on two particular aspects of interviews that make it way more better than any other qualitative data gathering methods like surveys or even group interviews. The first one is that we can drill down and get additional details from the interviewees. And the other one is that sometimes they actually let you know about some really juicy details or really important details that they are reluctant to share when it's, for example, in a written medium. And I'm focusing on these two because to ensure that we get these particular two advantages, we have to design the entire interview protocol from the start to finish while considering these two advantages in mind. Because interviews come with two specific constraints, right? It is a time constraint. People are going to run out the moment your interview time ends because they are busy, because you are hiring the experts. The other one is that if you are not careful, then they are not going to give you those additional details and they are never going to be opening up to give you those important details that you're looking for. So the steps before, during, and after interviews must be carefully considered. So that's what this entire tutorial is going to be about, how we can ensure that we can get all the details that we want from the interviewees. So when you are designing the interview protocol, we have to consider a few things, right? Like what questions to ask, and specifically, since you're in a time constraint, because people are going to discuss a lot of things, what questions to prioritize and how to avoid biases in those questions so that your data is clean, the information that you're getting is not biased from the interviewees. And also, like, for example, how many interviewers will be there and what will be their roles. So I'll be talking about each of those as we go through. So there are multiple ways how people have been designing interviews, and particularly what I think is that a semi-structured approach is the best because it gives a structure that you want to go through, but it also allows you to be flexible while you're going through the interviews. So it allows open-ended questions, and it also allows the interviewers to come up with additional questions on the fly based on the responses that they are getting. And sometimes there are different approaches that people do. Like, for example, they apply the laddering technique. So what that means is that, let's say, for example, you are taking interviews from people who are working in the automobile industry. So you ask them something like, let's say, what do you work on? And what kind of advantages does your product bring compared to other competitors? And they respond to that. And then you go with a follow-up question like, why do you think that is? Is it based on experience? Is it based on some kind of data, or is it your assumption? So this kind of laddering technique allows you to go in depth. But the semi-structured, since it's so flexible and focuses on getting the additional details, it's also intense and requires sophistication from the interviewer. So what that means is that, let's say, for example, sometimes because they're talking, they don't have a predetermined script, there is no script, they will give you conflicting information at times. So for example, at the start of the interview, they say something, and at the 50th minute of the interview, they say something that completely contradicts what they said at the earlier stage. If you don't remember what they have been saying throughout those all 50 minutes, then you cannot ask them like, oh, earlier you have said something that does not really align with what you said just now. So why do you say this now? What does that actually mean? So you have to keep in mind like what's going on and what they have been saying, which is why I was saying that often in semi-structured interviews, it's better to have two people for taking the interviews. So when people design the semi-structured interview guide, have a specific agendas in mind, mark the important questions that you must ask so that you can be flexible and omit the not so necessary questions. And because it's flexible, sometimes you like to jump across the agendas. And as I've already covered, the lettering technique as well. So the usual structure for semi-structured interviews is that you start with a very easy warm-up questions so that they kind of like open up to you and they talk about easy things so that they become comfortable while talking with you, kind of like having a conversation. And usually controversial questions come at the later stage because by that time they have eased up. They are now comfortable sharing information with you, and there's kind of like a trust between the interviewer and the interviewee. And specifically demographic questions, they are recommended to be asked at the last stage because if you ask them this kind of private demographic related questions to them at first, they might freeze up. They might be reluctant to share any more other information. So these are based on the existing recommendation guides that I have studied, and I also think this is the way that we should be doing. So any questions at this point? All good? Okay. So I want to talk a bit about avoiding biases in questions as well, because if you don't ask the question in the right way, they might be leading, they might result in getting socially desirable responses, or people might just freeze up and don't give you the answer that they want to give. So I'm going to give you a few examples based on what you're working on. So, for example, teleportation is a great facility for automobiles, right? Teleoperations. That question itself is leading because it kind of gives the intuition what you're expecting to hear. It kind of like says that, oh, I should be agreeing with that. Or, for example, how do you view integrating AI with teleoperations? Now, the entire industry is going with AIs. So the social desirable answer will be like, oh, AI is great and we are loving it, right? People will say, because if someone says that, oh, AI sucks and we don't like it, they'll feel like, oh, maybe these researchers will not be expecting that response from me. So to be desirable, to make them happy, I should be saying about the AI and teleoperation in a positive light. So we should be careful about posing our question in that particular way. Or what about
Uh,
self-censorship? Yeah,
quick question. Quick question. How would you ask then about their view on AI along with teleoperation?
I'll come to that right next. All right.
Okay.
So let me talk about the bias that first and then how to address those. And self-censorship, like, can you tell us an embracing event directly? If you ask it like that, then they're going to freeze up. So there are other ways you can raise the same questions. Like, for example, what are your thoughts about the pros and cons of teleoperations? So you're giving them the platform that, oh, let's talk about the positive aspects first and the negative aspects later, so that they know what you're expecting. Or, for example, if it's about socially desirable responses, you at first say that, oh, in our previous interactions with other people in the industry, some people have said that they're positive about it. Some people have said they're not so positive about it. So there are all sorts of spectrum that we have already seen. So what do you think about this? So in that way, you're actually giving them the notion that it's okay to be anywhere within the spectrum of positive and negative. They can have a balanced viewpoint, they can have a negative viewpoint, or they can have a positive viewpoint. So does it answer your question, Adwait? All right, perfect. And finally, about the embracing event, you kind of like actually extrapolate from the previous question, like pros and cons. And then when they talk about the cons, you ask them for specific examples. When they talk about the pros, you ask them about specific examples because they will say a lot of things. And then you drill down, like, all right, you said these are the pros. Can you give us an example based on your experience or any other experience that your colleagues or your peers or your people in your team have experienced? Can you tell us, give us more details? in that way, not only you are getting the opinions, but you're actually getting actual events, facts that have already happened, that they have experienced. And those are very important, very useful when it comes to gathering qualitative research data, right? Still with me, everyone? Perfect. Okay, so in my opinion, the semi-structure interview guide should be continuously refined after each interviews, because that's what I also did. So for example, in the last study that I did, I conducted about like 20 interviews. And that structured guide was refined after each interview, because sometimes every interviewee gave us some kind of details that we did not know about, or we didn't realize was very important. So like, all right, this person gave us something really interesting. We should ask everyone else about that as well. So always reassess everything. Try to figure out what's working well, what's not working so well, what needs to be modified after every round of interviews, after every interview as well. So after, let's say, for example, you take 10 interviews, you will probably feel that, all right, we're in a good stage, so you might not be needed to refine the interview guide after every interview. But usually it's to be defined after each interview for the first 10 interviews. Let's say it's a ballpark number. So this is something that is from my study. So it's kind of like a semi-structured interview guide. So as you can see, you have the section with a specific agenda and then some other questions. We don't ask these questions directly in this way. This is kind of like something that you adapt on the fly. So as I've mentioned, interviews are intense and require sophistication. So remember that it will probably require at least two interviewers, because one will have to stick with the guide. The other one will be like, all right, I'm going to absorb everything this person is talking about and then ask any follow-up questions that are not within the interview guide. Now, we have tried multiple approaches to do that. For example, at one time, it was like there was this other interviewer with me who was typing me questions during the interviews. Like, all right, can you ask this? Can you ask that? And I was getting very confused at that time because it doesn't work that way. The reason is that when I'm listening to the interviewee, I cannot also read something else my colleague has shared with me, think about it, and then introduce it in my own flow. Because if I try to do that, I'll be missing what the interviewee is saying right now. So, so if you can pull that off, that's fine. But for me, it doesn't work. So one person should be focusing on asking questions, and the other one which should be focusing on sticking to the guide. And if anyone has any question that comes to mind, they should ask that question themselves, because otherwise it's going to break the flow. And of course, the first interview probably should be taken by the most experienced person in the team, because it kind of shows the other person about how to raise questions, how to interact, and how to do it in a very hands-on approach. So they can also learn from it. So that also helps. The other one is that the attitude, right? If you're not interested in taking the interview, apparently the interviewee will not be interested. If you're like, oh, I know everything, I'm just here to know your opinion, which doesn't matter, then they are also going to freeze up. So as interviewer, we should be knowing about each of the questions thoroughly. We should understand the purpose of each question and establish priority in each of the agendas and in the overall structure. The reason why it's important to understand the purpose of each question is that based on what their responses are, the priority will sometimes shift, even in those important questions. Like sometimes you will have to omit some important question because you will realize that even though there's an important question in the context of what the interviewee is saying toward the interviews, it's not anymore. So it is going to be very flexible. So I also noticed that it's usually good to remind the interviewees about the upcoming interview and share them the consent form and what's going to happen. Kind of like a very brief overview, like, all right, this is the topic, this is the conference consent form that I'm going to share with you. So see you tomorrow. Works like that. And at the start, remind them about a few things, because as a person who is going to get interviewed about the inner details of what they are working on, what they have to be careful about, and what might be potentially embarrassing for their industry or for their organization, they are taking a huge risk while talking with us. So, so we have to make sure that they feel comfortable. So we have to stress about a few points, like focus on a few points before even starting the interview. Like, all right, so this interview will be recorded, yes, but any sensitive information will be anonymized and it will be destroyed after we transcribe the things. You can redact anything that you have said at any point during the interview, after the interview, by emailing us. If you want to redact anything, it's fine. And they have the option to stop and leave the interview at any point when they want. And the point of saying all of this explicitly before starting the interview, when they just join your interview session, is to make sure that they understand that we value their opinion and we also value about their need for privacy and their need for security when they are exchanging all of those sensitive information with us. So
Quick
yeah,
question. At what point do we share the consent form?
okay. So uh, you are talking about the informed consent form, right?
Yep.
So what we worked on was something like what we did was like we emailed them the consent form. We said that if you agree, then just show up at the interview. So that was like
Okay.
24 hours before the interview.
Right. So exactly. So in that first email, right, the 24-hour email, that's when we send the consent form, and then with the Zoom link. And in the next, before we start the interview, we still do we ask for their consent for everything to be recorded and for the interview itself?
It's not
Explicit.
asking for consent because they have showed up after receiving the consent
Okay.
form. So the informed consent form is like, I am informing you about the whole study and what's going to happen. So if you agree, please show up. So
Okay.
by being there, they're consenting. And
Okay.
then we are saying that, all right, you have already seen the consent form, but we still want to focus on this particular points. Like these are important for your need for safety and privacy. So we're going to ensure these things from our end.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So
So a
we don't have
very
to
brief
remind them
summary.
of the consent form or take consent or anything like that, right?
Sorry, what?
So we don't have to remind them of the consent form or take consent. We just have to tell them that we're going to record it, but everything will be anonymized and blah blah blah, and they can leave at any point.
So it also depends on what you have written in the consent form as well. So in our consent form, it was said that by attending the interview, you
Yeah,
are
it's the
giving us
same
consent.
consent form. It's a
Yeah,
copy.
yeah, 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 yeah. And actually, Sidi was asking me a question about signing the consent form. Like, is it a good idea to have it
Oh,
in written form? And I was like, let's not have signs. Just by being there, they're already taking a risk in their career.
Yeah,
So
ask for this question.
it's a theoretical risk at least, right?
yeah,
They're going to be reluctant. So
yeah.
it's fine to not
Yeah.
take actual signs.
No, but the consent form says that it's an oral consent. Even the IRB says that we will obtain oral consent. So there is no, I mean, we'll obtain, basically, they won't need to sign the form. That's what the IRB says.
Yeah.
So I think that. So one quick thing, right after this, can you record yourself in the first? So we have our interview script. Can you record yourself for the first 5 minutes interviewing, say, Victor
Mhm.
with that script from the very beginning? Like, from the point, say, Victor, the interviewee, gets on the call, including talking about consent and blah blah blah, every single thing. Just
All
the
right.
first 5 minutes, so we know
Yeah, I can
exactly
try.
how to
Yeah.
get.
Yeah, will be fun. But you have to share with me about at
Yeah,
least
Victor,
some of the things. Yeah.
Victor will share everything with you. That's not a problem.
Okay. Yeah. All right. And like I said, after the interview, refine the guide, write notes about important insights because I found this to be really useful. So after each interview, I actually shared with Dennis and Adwait and Kevin, my team members, about what I found was very interesting, and that helped me refine the insights at the later stages. Because when you're fresh out of the interview, you remember everything about every exciting thing that they have said. But if you try to remember all of those after 20 interviews or from that 1 hour long transcript, it's not going to work. So remember to write notes after the interviews. And of course, always thank the participant for their valuable insights because they want to feel appreciated, and they should be felt appreciated so that they are willing to participate in future studies like similar to this. And it also builds up network for you. And try to get concluding remarks. And this part is important. So what that means is that after asking all of the questions that I wanted to ask from the guide, I still had some window for additional discussions. So for example, I asked something like, let's say Victor is the interview. It would be something like, hey, Victor, so thank you for answering all those questions that I had in mind. Do you have any kind of additional thoughts that is related to what we're doing? And any other remarks that you want to make that we should be aware of? So it's kind of like giving them the free rein on what they want to share with us so that they can share whatever they think is important. And it always results in sometimes really fascinating insights. Like, for example, some interviewees focused on education and security, basically like introducing things in security curriculum or other things. Sometimes people focus on some other things that we did not even consider. So always important to ask them about their concluding remarks. And by the end of the day, send them a short thank you email for formality and also to make sure that they feel appreciated. So any questions at this point?
I may have a questions regarding how do you manage the time that the interviewees may spend too much time to answer a single question, and you still have many questions to ask. So how do you manage that?
Yeah, that's always a difficult task, right? Because sometimes they want to go on and on giving you details that you don't want, or sometimes they are giving you really important details. So how do you balance between those two? So let's talk about the additional details that you don't need part. Sometimes you have to politely intervene, right? Nudge them, like saying that, all right, so let me summarize what you're saying and tell me if I'm missing something here. So that way you let them know that you understood what they're talking about and you can proceed for the next questions. That's something that have worked for me in the past, but you have to be really polite and be very careful to not appear rude while doing that. Because otherwise, it's awkward when someone asks that, all right, can you please make things short, right? But for the additional details part, like where they're actually talking about important things, that's where you have to be flexible. Like, all right, is it possible to extend this interview by, let's say, 10 minutes or 20 minutes? Can we take an additional interview from you? You have to raise those questions because if those additional details are important, then you cannot simply pack everything within that predetermined time slot. So, and sometimes,
Go on, sorry.
yeah. So, and sometimes what we also do is like, can we email? Can you please? Is it possible to ask you these additional questions via email to you so that we know whether it's possible to take an additional interview? Is it possible to basically just build communication through email? What are the options in our plate? And based on that, we can become flexible. Yeah, Adwait.
Yeah, so I was saying is, so another thing I've observed that has succeeded so far is the first time they talk a lot, whether it's relevant or irrelevant, let them do it. Right? Sometimes people just talk a lot initially and then they stick to the point. But if that recurs and if it's a lot of detail, if they just go rambling on about something, often what I've seen is they usually converge on one single opinion. So usually someone has some opinion about what the industry should do or what somebody should do, or they just keep repeating the same thing. So every time they go rambling on, even if it's for different questions, they just come back to the same thing. And so there you have this opportunity of saying, I think we've captured that before, but let me just quickly summarize. And just because we have a little limited time, we probably want to move on to the next question. But it's important to be able to catch that they're repeating themselves and just going on and on in multiple questions. But if you catch that, it's very easy to interrupt because it's very polite when you do that. You just remind them that they've actually said that. And we're very grateful, that we know that we captured that particular sentiment. That's very helpful. But then we move on to the next thing. But the other thing I want to talk about is if they're giving you something extremely valuable, sometimes you don't even have to ask people if you want to extend the time of the interview. If they're truly trying to help you, it might also make sense to just continue letting them talk and continue asking questions, and don't worry about time, because these
Yeah,
are
yeah, yeah.
people who, who are very interested in helping you out, and it's just a conversation. It's just like at a conference, right? Sometimes you talk to someone for 15 minutes, and sometimes you talk to someone for 2 hours, and you don't even realize where time has passed. So it's like, just let it happen, because if you explicitly remind them, then they'll also get conscious about time, and then the future interactions will also be time limited. Like every time you ask them a question, they'll first think about it, summarize in their mind, and then answer. And that is not what you want, because you want fresh answers, straight like this, no recirculation, no second thoughts. You just want the actual literal thoughts, right? So
Yeah,
it might just make sense to not remind them about time, not say anything about time, let them talk. Like in most cases. But if someone is just wasting your time, then it makes sense to interrupt. But
yeah.
other cases, just let it be. Like that's
Yeah, I want to actually add something to what Odit just said, and we are on the same page. It's just that I did not clarify this at first. Don't talk about the time at all if they're giving you important information. Just ask them about whether they're available for additional interview or questions at the end of the interview. Because like I said, you have to prioritize your questions, right? So you have to decide what questions to ask. And if they're giving you important details and giving you crucial information, then you start prioritizing right there and then without interrupting their flow. Because if you make them conscious, they are going to freeze up. And we don't want that to happen. Yeah. Any other questions?
And normally, how do you start for example, the warming up sentences, like introduce yourself or introduce the purpose of your interviews, something like that. So how do you warm up? And based on your experience, what is the best suggestion or the best topic to talk about for the starting sentences?
Okay, so when we are introducing ourselves, they already know what they're doing by attending the interview because they have seen the consent form. But usually it's okay to spend like a minute or so at most introducing your about who we are and what we're doing. Um, while also mentioning that we know they know because we have previously communicated, but we are also there to learn about their experience and everything else, which is very important to what we're doing. That's why we are here. So it's kind of like saying that, all right, we both know that we are here for this particular purpose, and we want your insights on this particular topic because we think it's going to be very important for what we're doing, if that makes sense.
Yes, yes.
And I think when I do that practice talk with Victor, it will become a bit more easier,
yeah.
even though it is going to be completely on the fly.
Yeah. No, but it's like if you have just one sentence that you say to everybody at the very beginning,
Yeah.
welcoming them to the interview and just stating the topic of the interview
Mhm.
and a few other initial things, we can adapt based on whatever script, because the interview guide is different and the interview script is another whole thing. So the interview
Yes.
script is like the literal scripted things you want to say, and you probably want to have a few sentences, and then you will ask questions, and then it will flow on its own. But the initial set of questions, the last set of questions, or the initial set of statements, the last set of statements, it has to be very scripted. So, Victor and Yichen, if you're interested in interviewing along with Victor, the best way to learn how to interview is to actually have someone experienced interview you. So usually when people practice, they practice interviewing by interviewing somebody else. That is just like blind leading the blind, because you already don't know how to do it. Like, what are you going to learn by doing it, right? So watch Amit interview Victor, or watch Amit interview Yichen, and then that's how you will learn. That's how you'll just learn by observation. How, and then you can practice amongst yourself, and you can even do a pilot interview with me, a pilot interview with CD, and so that's how you'll practice, and we'll give you feedback, and then we can start off with the actual thing. And then me and Sidi, one of us or both of us will always be there. So if we pick something, I would recommend only one of us being there. If it's because otherwise people get very nervous if there are like two or three people. So just two interviewers. Me and Sidi can decide based on our schedules or based on, if she knows somebody better, then she'll probably be there. But if it's a general person, then I can be there. But then we'll ask follow-up questions and everything as well. But just practice with Amit and you guys will be fine.
Yeah. So this is the actual interview guide that I use during the interviews. And as you can
Nice.
see, there's this intro that I have written, and I basically parroted it for each of the interviews. And the screenshot that I shared was in the paper. That was like very focused, very abridged. But in this one, I have like different paths. All right, if they're in a team, this is what I ask. If they're influencer, this is what we do. It's kind of like having this breakdown of questions. And as you can see, there are all sorts of like colors and other things to indicate like what I thought is very important. Um, so so make sure that your interview guide kind of like gives you the hints about which questions are to be prioritized all the time. Like this is focusing on, I actually had like multiple versions here for people. But yeah, always have a script ready to kind of like introducing yourselves.
So this is a
So
good. Victor, can you prepare a similar one for you just using our questions? It'll also be very easy for us to track instead of the Google Doc. This seems like a very easy way to track, right?
yeah, it's a spreadsheet, by the way, not Google Docs. I found spreadsheets to be easier because like cells and parallel paths. Because docs are just vertical, so you have to scroll up and
Yep.
down a lot. You
No,
don't.
we have ours in docs. That's what I was saying. Docs, like this is not. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, also, I mean, I had a question about, I think you covered one sort of end of the spectrum when it came to when you have an interviewer that actually like gives you a lot of information and you're sort of limited with time. But at the other end, like, did you have challenges with like interviewers that like we're not giving you enough or we're not giving you anything concrete? And like, how did you sort of like maybe get them to talk or get them to loosen up if they were not like, giving you anything, basically?
So what you're saying is that they are giving information, but in a very vague way.
No, what I'm saying is like they probably okay, maybe something like that, but at the other end is like saying they're not giving you anything or they're not giving you enough or they're not like sharing, like because maybe they feel like it's like intellectual property or they feel like they don't want to give you like organization like secrets and stuff like that. So
Mhm.
I'm interested if you had like those kind of encounters and how did
Mm.
you sort of handle it if you did.
You talk about general practices. So, for example, if something is too specific to their organization and they are like, not going to share this because I think it's going to violate the intellectual property rights or is going to violate the non-disclosure agreement. In those cases, you talk about, all right, in a very general settings, what do you think is the general practice? You kind of make it generic to understand what they or their peers do instead of specifically what the organization does, so that you can kind of like have an idea about what are the expectations, and then you down on that, like, all right, so you have said that, is it based on your prior experience at your organization or something as a trend that you have noticed across the organization or a subset of the organizations? You still try to like kind of poke holes in what they're doing, but again, people are going to be sometimes reluctant and you have to be careful around how you raise those questions. And that's why it's very important to make sure that they understand that whatever they're having is kind of like a privileged communication. So it's our responsibility and duty to protect their privacy and to ensure that they are going to feel safe. Yeah.
Okay. But what if, for example, you meet you also sort of similar in the same question area? If you have an interviewee that is not, how would I put it, that's not like, talking a lot. maybe by nature, so like how do you like just go with the flow, or do you like try to ask more questions or try to get them to loosen up? Sometimes like by nature, like I guess people in like, CS or security or something might not be very, very um, you know, they might not be very communicative in that sense.
So, in addition to what Adwait said, something else also came to my mind. It's that, like I said, interviews are very sophisticated and intense, right? It's true for both the interviewer and the interviewee. So even if they talk a lot at the start of the interviews, remember that you are asking them the easy questions. So it's easy to give you detailed responses to those easy questions and talk a lot. But once you are drilling down and asking the complex questions, hard questions, difficult questions that requires them to think, they will automatically start talking less. That's something that I have noticed consistently, especially if they have significant experience, because they are thinking a lot about all of the years of experiences and what they think about your question, right? So that's something to keep in mind. And what I felt is that if they are good, they value their own time, and they will try to give you answer in a concise manner because you're hiring experts. If they're generic people like who don't have any expertise, they will often give you very elaborate but useless responses. But I think if they're experts, they generally don't talk too much. They try to give you the concise information in a very practical manner.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's never a good idea to interrupt them. Kind of like give them a cue, like, so what I have done is that I always ensure that my video is live during the interview, even if the interviewee is not interested in sharing their own videos. And you can kind of like give them the cues based on your facial expressions to express that, oh, I actually have a question, I want to interrupt, but I can't interrupt you. And if they're noticing all those things, they'll automatically stop as well. Like for example, if you kind of like raise a hand or I don't know, some kind of give it
Yep.
away, because if you interrupt them, it's not going to be taken well if they're experts. That's what
Yeah.
my intuition.
So one thing, the other thing I've seen is it's a good idea. It's a good thing when people talk less. Usually, when they talk more, you get a lot of repetition and redundancy, and it's not that great. Now in terms of if you want, when is like, I don't think it's a bad thing to have few statements but really valuable ones. The only time you want, we want them to talk more is if something in the responses was not clear. And there's an obvious way to deal with it. Just ask a follow-up question. Like if they say something and if there are some variables there, you don't really know what those mean. You want to know more, just ask about that specific thing. Feel free to follow up and deviate a little bit from the interview script, and that's totally okay. Because otherwise you won't understand it even when you look at the transcript later, right? Just won't know what to make of that response. So you definitely, like, if they use some jargon or if they use some specific examples, ask them more about it if you want to know. The other way to, if you're really afraid of people just giving you yes and no answers, then the solution to that is simple. Don't ask yes and no questions.
Yeah.
Like, don't ask questions where they can give you binary. Don't ask binary questions. Just ask categorical questions, and you'll get good. And none of our questions are binary questions. So there is no issue with our current script. So you shouldn't have to worry about that. But even in the follow-up questions, always ask about their opinion or what they feel something should be like. And don't really give them the answer and ask yes or no. Like that is always going to have them speak. And once you start with one word answers, then it just spirals downhill from there. So don't make that mistake.
Yeah. That reminds me of one thing that I have noticed. In a conversation, sometimes we give cues, right? Say, for example, Victor is saying something, and I'm like, doing that. While in normal conversation, that's okay. Make sure that you have muted yourself during their response, and until they're finished, don't talk or don't make any sound at all. Mute yourself, because otherwise your transcript is going to get really, really, really messy. And it will be a pain in everywhere to handle that. Okay. So please, because I have seen people make that mistake everywhere, especially when they're young and new. I have, when I was teaching people about interviews previously, they have made that same mistake. I was like, please don't, just mute yourself, because otherwise it's going to get messy.
Yeah, this kind of like sort of is this good segue into like the question I was going to ask next about like some of your biggest challenges, like when you were, from like the interview to like transcript, like things that you feel like you did in interview that maybe you shouldn't have done that made your, coding part and transcribing like really difficult.
So transcribing now has become a bit easier because of all these softwares that lets you do that, but still it's a very time consuming and challenging process, especially if the transcription software is not good, the automated transcription, the speech to text software that you are going to use. I particularly used was it Whisper AI? It's probably open source. It's open source, and I found it really useful. But some of the other softwares were not that useful. Now, the reason why I'm talking about that is because sometimes there will be like 1 in 100 words or 1 in 50 words that will be messed up. So you still have to listen to the entire interview while checking the transcript, because otherwise entire sentence meaning will change. And it's going to be very time consuming. It's going to be extremely time consuming because you have to be fully focused, and sometimes the transcription, the speech to text software will be messed up because the audio is not clear. So you have to listen to that particular portion of audio multiple times to understand what is actually going on, what that person said, and then fix the transcript. So it's going to be time consuming. It's going to be challenging. It's going to be difficult, but something that we have to do for good research. Does that answer your question, Victor?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
In its entirety? Because I think you probably had a sub question in there.
The sub question was kind of, I guess, some of the other like challenges that I generally face.
Yeah. So that's why I was like, oh, I think I missed something. Okay, so challenges. Like I said, like look at this document, right? There are all these questions with all these agendas. And sometimes it will be like, oh, I have asked this question where they have started responding in a way that also answers something here. So how do you make sure that that you don't ask any questions repeatedly? So you have to focus on that, and that's something that will come with practice. It's difficult, it's challenging to remember what they said, why they said, when they said, so that you can adapt on the fly. And there is no other way of doing that other than practice. And it's challenging. It's going to be challenging. So my recommendation is that take at least 3 pilot interviews per interviewer. So each interviewer should be taking at least 3 pilot interviews on by themselves, so that they know what each question is about. They know what the purpose of each question and how to prioritize each question accordingly. And that way it should be very, very prepared. And like I said, let the best person in the team take the first interview at least.
So I would recommend Victor and each, and again, if you're interested, you can just be the second interview. That's also okay. But I would recommend both of you to interview me separately, CD separately. So there's at least 2 interviews and one more person. That would probably be Amit. But at the same time, let him interview you guys first, at least for the first few minutes and the last few minutes of the interview. So you know exactly what to expect, because that is probably what is key there, because even the initial sentences, the intro script, it has to be very precise, so you're not stressed about that. The later questions you'll ask, that's not a problem, but the initial script, so it is not awkward, and so you're not stressed, the interviewer is not stressed, so to make it as easy as possible. So but those are your 3 interviews if you want, and if CD you have any other suggestions for a fourth person, let us know. We can also interview that person.
Yeah.
Okay, I mean, another question I wanted to ask is like, did you, for some reason, maybe while you were interviewing, particularly in the initial stages, did you miss questions? And did you feel like maybe when you were doing your transcription, like, oh, I probably should have asked this question, or maybe like, maybe when you were looking at the transcript or like looking at the sort of summary of the interview, did that happen? And then did that like, just ask you?
So when you're looking at the transcript, okay, let me actually emphasize this part first. Like I said, that 1 hour of interview is going to drain you mentally. So for me, I was like, I cannot possibly take another interview on the same day. I cannot possibly take another interview on the next day. I'll probably need like a 2-day break in between each interview. Because like I said, on that 1 hour, people generally focus for something for 5 minutes and then take a break. If you're talking about like intense 100% focus. For interview, I was like, I'm going to give 100% focus on this person, and after that, I'm going to get exhausted. So I did not look at the transcript after until after I have taken a long break after the interview, right? But right after the interview is done, you have fresh everything in mind. So at that point, start refining the questions. That's something that you can do. You can also start writing the notes on what you have noticed because they are fresh in your mind right after that 1 hour mark of interview. So refining questions, absolutely right after the interview, yes. But when you are handling the transcripts, yeah, I don't see why not.
Or you never like, I guess, found maybe some questions that you probably could have asked or did not ask while you were looking at the transcript, like weeks later or months later or something.
Not really,
Okay.
not in this particular case, because like say the transcript is not going to give you any additional information, right? The transcript is just the written format of what you have already received, and all the things that you can think of you have already probably thought about that right after or during the interviews. But maybe it's possible. For me, I didn't experience that.
Okay. Sounds
Yeah.
good.
But let's say, for example, theoretically, after going through the transcript, you realize that, oh, I should have asked this question. Maybe I need answer to this question. Maybe send them an email asking that, hey, while going through the transcript of the audio that we have already destroyed, this particular question came to my mind. So is it possible to answer that in email or in a very short 10-minute Zoom interview, if
Okay.
possible? Or what do you think about that? So keep that part in your script. Like, say, for example, say something like, thank you for blah, blah. Oh, by the way, this part is important. We always ask them about additional people that they may have in mind that we can get in touch with for additional interviews if we were short on people for interviews. And this is the question that I mentioned. Like, this is the textbook approach for asking them about their concluding remarks.
Yep. So we need these two. But another thing that I wanted to sort of emphasize is you can also just be just like Amit is being right now, right? You see how his demeanor is right now. Be very friendly, be open, and don't make it a too formal, don't make it like a job interview where it's extremely formal and everybody's, just be relaxed, be happy about it, and everybody will also be just as relaxed. And they will actually tell you a lot more. Like you don't have to look serious or sound serious. You can just be just like you are, because the people we are contacting are technical people, right? They're either engineers very high up or they're researchers. So they are used to these kinds of interactions. So just be like a student who wants to know more. Like don't have this other personality, just be yourself, and that will automatically motivate them to help you out. So make sure basically they need to feel that they want to help you out. That's it. And they'll give you more than you expect, and then you can easily email people and whether it's for follow-ups or whether it's for something. So but to leave that way out, just be very chill and it'll be fine.
Yeah, so I have been at the other end of interviews. So basically, I was interviewed by people from other organizations before. And sometimes they kind of like freeze up when they make a mistake. They're like, oh, I made a mistake. They explicitly mention that if you make a mistake, just ignore that. If you don't make a big deal out of it, they are not going to make a big deal out of it. They're not even going to probably notice. So because
Yep.
it's a live interaction in conversation, and people sometimes just say something in a wrong way or say something wrong, right? Can happen to anyone. So they're experienced people, they know about that. So it's fine.
Also, if you say basically by mistake, someone probably means that let's say you asked a question in one particular way instead of another way, and it changed the meaning of the question entirely, right? So don't treat it like a mistake. Think of it like you asked another question. And then if you want to ask the original question, just ask the original question again after some time. Nobody's going to notice.
Yeah.
And you'll get your answer to the original question as well as another question that you accidentally asked. But yeah, don't focus on, don't even like, not just don't say that you made mistake, but don't even focus on your mistakes. This is just like even like presentations, right? When you're giving a presentation, make a mistake, move on. Nobody should even know. You should not even know. Just move on and continue with the thing. The important part is to, just go through every single thing. And even if you miss a question like you're asking him, it's okay. You're
Yeah.
going to get so much insight that it's going to be very hard to pack it into one paper. If you miss one question for one interview, not a problem. It's
Yeah.
not going to hurt at all.
Yeah. So
So
try to have a friendly, fun conversation with someone who is willing to share information with you and you are eager to learn from them. The attitude should be like that. Like, yes, sometimes we will be using industry specific jargons to be on the same page with them, but make sure that those jargons are introduced by them first. Try to be as generic as possible from your end as interviewer, because even in the industry at different subfields, they will have their own jargons with their own understanding. So don't introduce jargons yourselves. Be as generic and have friendly, fun conversations. Like if you find something funny, laugh at it. Like not laugh at them because they are being humorous. You join in the fun. Like for example, there was this guy who was like, we were asking that person about fuzzing in security analysts, and that person was like, oh, fuzzing, I think it's kind of like the Shakespearean monkeys. You assign 100 infinite number of monkeys to write something on keyboard randomly, and then they generate something Shakespearean, like a Shakespeare literature. I found it very funny, and I was like laughing along with him at that. And then when he was like being very annoyed, expressing his annoyance about static analysis tools and their false positive, he was like, false positives, false positive, false positives. I have this 10 years of data which just shows me false positive. And I was like laughing along with him when he was sharing that humor. And I still remember those days. Those are like one of my favorite interviews. I still remember even his voice. So try to have fun. They will be memorable. They will help you find all those interesting and insights. Yeah. So any other questions? I
no,
hope this hopefully going to be useful for your interviews.
So I have a question. Just remind me, like, for a single interview, can we have a two round of the interviews if their schedule is not for like cannot if they cannot find the 50 minutes for the whole interview, but they would like to participate in. Because let me explain why I ask this question. Because next week I ask my close friends in the industry and I send them the email draft as well as a consent form. So he said that in their companies normally they work at 8 to 5 p.m. from Monday to Friday, and I think that will be the normal potential interview time for us. But he said it's very difficult for him, particularly in recent weeks, to find the 50 minutes for the whole interview. So he asked me, the first question is can we do twice if he would like to participate in, so that we can maybe control like 30 minutes or something like that. We can divide them. So based on your experience, do you think that is good or it is bad to have a complete interview?
So we have to understand our position, right? We need the information from them. So we have to be as flexible as possible. So if they want to be interviewed during a weekend, for example, or even at odd hours, if we think that this person's insight is very valuable, we have to give them that space so that they are happy about the time, about the opportunity, so that they know that, all right, I feel important because these researchers are going the extra mile for me so that I can give them the information that they need. So make them feel appreciated and happy. Yes. And I have not actually broken down interviews before. So I don't have any particular insights to that.
But
And
previously, how long your interviews
okay,
was? Like
so
also like
my interviews
15
were like
minutes?
1 hour. Yeah. So 1 hour. So that means that sometimes some interviews ended
1 hour.
by, let's say, 50 minutes. Some interviews ended by 1 hour and 10 minutes. And when we crossed the
Okay.
1 hour mark, we're close to the 1 hour. I was like, look, I appreciate your time and I am a lot from you. Is it possible to extend this interview by 10 minutes or so? Because I still have some questions that I want to ask you, but if you can, that's also fine. Maybe I will email those questions to you. But this way, this is how you actually show that you respect their time and you respect their schedule.
So about the split interview. So if they can't find 1 hour during the weekday, we can still ask them if they're okay with weekends, we can do weekends as well. Anytime that works for them, even
Okay.
if it's like 2 a.m. for us, that's fine. We will
Alright.
still do it. So we can first tell them that they don't have to worry about uh time zones or anything. They can just tell us a time and we will be there. We'll interview them, no matter what time it is for us.
Yes.
But another thing we can do if they still cannot find a time and if they're like we need to split this up, right? We can probably do it split, just that in the next interview, in the second one, if we find we will have to remind them of something that we were talking about just before they left. So we'll just have to give them some context into the section or into the topic that they were, and then it should be fine. But ideally, I would prefer not to do that because other you lose all of the context.
Yeah.
And if you build a really good rapport, then you sort of lose that as well, and it becomes extremely tricky. So
Yeah, that's what
if
I'm reluctant
they,
about. That's why I was saying that, look, we need the information all on its own, and it's us who need the information from them. So we
yeah,
should be as flexible as possible so that they feel that, oh, they're going the extra mile for
yeah,
me so that I can give them the uninterrupted interview. Because let's say, for example, if you split it up and on the first interview, they say something, they are not going to remember that. And they
yeah,
are not going to go through the interview transcript or audio or whatever because they don't have the time. You might be able to, and if they say something contradictory, it'll be like, oh, this is what you said in the previous day and this contradicts what you're saying right now. They will not have the context at all. They'll literally forget everything. So
yeah.
try to avoid splitting up interviews as much as possible. If it's something that is unavoidable, then tough luck, but give them all possible paths so that they go for an uninterrupted interview. That's what my stance is. Because people are going to be from all over the world, right? So they will be in odd time zones that will work for them, but not for us. So let's
Yeah.
pretend that they are in different time zones, maybe.
Makes sense.
Yep.
So if we are pretty much near the end of this meeting, I would like to share the screen because I would like to discuss with you about the consent form that I put some new information on it. Let me